Shalom, Israelites. This is Israel ben Israel for the Israelite Brotherhood. Alright, Israelites, man, it's a bunch of Israelites, man, that, man, that they don't make no sense, man. And after all this time, you would think that they would have an idea of what's going on. But the thing is, man, a lot of Israelites don't study, man, and they reject truth, man, real easy. It's like our ancestors, since we broke the covenant, that we've been real gullible for falsehood and false history. You can basically see that the way the Israelites are living, that they will accept falsehood over truth in some things that are plain to see. And one of the things, man, that is plain to see is that we're not from America, and that America, where we are at now, and how we was brung here in slave ships. We was brung here in slave ships, and how America is not our native land, and that how some Israelites are convinced. I don't see how that America is our homeland, and therefore we don't have to go anywhere or try to strive to get out of this land and go to where we originally come from, and how Israelites believe that America is the promised land. And man, that's crazy, man. But you got Israelites that believe that. And then what they fail to do is research history. Research history, man. Some of the history is correct, that is incorrect when it comes to dealing with Israelite history, when you get it from our captors, and that they're not going to tell you the truth about real Israelite history. But other than that, world history, man, they kind of like pretty fair, about it. That's like here in the Americas, man, they didn't have domesticated sheeps. They didn't have domesticated sheeps, and it's a known fact that they only got domesticated sheeps and cattle when the conquistadors come over, and how the Native Americans didn't have a golden calf, and they didn't have Medjugorje. They lived in tents. They lived in animal skins and so forth, and how that they didn't have houses chopped from wood, using the axe, and then, you chop down a tree, and then, you can make a house. They didn't have that, and that's a documented fact that they didn't have that. But some of you Israelites, for some reason, think that, that we was always here. And look, man, they document basically the house constructions that we have today, even though some of it got a little Spanish spin on it, but like the rooms and the windows and so forth like that, man, we had that in the promised land in biblical days. And then it show you alone that America is not our home, but the domesticated sheeps, man. That we had to have sheeps, and we had to have goats and so forth, because we made sacrifices and so forth, and that we had goats that we put our sins on and then turned them loose. And it's a known fact that they didn't have domesticated animals here in the Americas. But for some reason, you Israelites, man, believe that America is your home. They done convinced you that. You've been convinced, and you think because that you run across some of these towns and names that has Hebrew names, not knowing that the conquistadors were basically the Sephardim that ran across North Africa into Spain when Herd Edomite temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and the Romans put them to flight, and how they went and settled in Spain, and then come to the Americas and so forth. And then, a lot of you Israelites, man, don't understand that, that in the Tanakh, in Exodus, that Pharaoh had horses. Pharaoh had horses and chased us. Chased us, when we fled Egypt, and how Pharaoh had horses and chariots and so forth, and how that none of that is originally from the Americas, and there's no horses in the Americas prior to the conquistadors coming here with them. So, you Israelites that believe America is our homeland, man, you get defeated real quick. And man, I'm talking about real quick, And it's a known fact that the natives didn't have domesticated animals and so forth. That they didn't have domesticated animals. They didn't have a axle with wheels. Man, do you see the axle right there, man? It took Metagory, man, to make those axles and then have wheels and so forth, and then to have domesticated animals to carry that and to pull that. You see, and that how it's easily to defeat the Israelites that think that the Americas always been our home. Man, there's a lot of wars going on in this world today, and that the wars are supposed to accumulate into our freedom. And we know that once our captors lose control over us, that we basically free, and that we can go, where we want to, and that how some of you Israelites are being programmed to stay here in the Americas and stay in captivity and stay here, and that how that they don't want you to go home. Man, don't y'all know that the people who we abandon our heritage to are slick scribes and professional liars, and been lying about world history for a long time, because it all boils down to us Israelites not coming into knowledge of who we are, and it's like this. During the Assyrian times, and this is not found in the Americas, that this is not found in the Americas, in how that the Assyrians had iconic figures and carvings and drawings and things about how the original Israelites looked, and that the Israelites were in the Mesopotamia area, or where the ancient Assyrian Empire was, and that those are images of real Israelites right here that's going into captivity. So man, there's some truth about where we were and where we come from, and then like I explained, that our ancestors come here, men, on slave ships. Man, we come here on slave ships just like the Tanakh say. You see, you're not in heritage, if you believe that we was always here in the Americas, because in the Tanakh, as part of the curses, it say that the Israelites would be taken to a bondage, which the name Egypt translated to bondage on ships. And then I prove over and over that, that we ran to Egypt during the Babylonian wars to do the Egyptian religion, which caused us to be captured in what's called Africa and brought to the Americas. Man, it's easy to understand. It's easy to understand, but you're going to have Israelites that try to argue this and try to fight against this, because they the type that you can make a slave out of forever, and they don't want to be free. But man, it's like they got a psychology of fight freedom, and don't be free once you get in captivity, and that they are just the opposite of somebody that's fighting for freedom and don't want to be in captivity. You see, once an Israelite break covenant, he's gullible for falsehood real easy, because we abandoned the truth, which was our covenant that the Creator had given us, which was the righteous way, man, to be. Yeah, man, it's awful that how Israelites, don't understand that the America didn't have domesticated animals and so forth, and that they didn't have the golden calf. The golden calf. If you Israelites can produce a golden calf in the BC days, around about 1406 BC, man, around about that time, then I reconsider some of this history that I showed, but I know for a fact that you're not gonna find no golden calves in the Americas because they didn't domesticate animals, and that the natives lived a uncivilized, unsophisticated lifestyle. I'm not knocking them, but they lived in animal skins. They lived in animal skins, and that they didn't have the metallurgy technology to make axes and to chop down trees and to build houses until the Spaniards come over or the conquistadors come over, who were the people that was in the promised land at one time until they was chased out by the Romans. So it's easily to retrace their footsteps, and it's easily to come to the conclusion that America didn't have the place of our captivity, didn't have domesticated animals and so forth, and that they didn't have animals, horses. They didn't have horses until the conquistadors come over. They didn't have domesticated animals. They didn't have domesticated horses. So you Israelites, they be trying to push America is our home. It is basically doing our enemies and captors' will. They want your mind messed up, and you be so confused that you don't know where you from. And then it's like the slavery thing. The people that we abandoned our heritage to, the Amorites, who are the Sephardims and the Sephardims, they are the fathers of enslaving peoples. In Babylon, they enslaved a lot of folks before we was even the Israelite nation. And then how did that same system of servitude and slavery was in the Americas, and that we know that Aaron Lopez is of this stock right here, and that how that when they brought the slaves, our ancestors over, capturing them in what's called Africa, that we were subjected to the same slavery that the peoples in Mesopotamia was enslaved with, even though they took it to another level in what's called chattel slavery, is that they treated us like animals and so forth, and that they had ownership over us the same as they would an animal and so forth, a cattle. So those are facts, man. So you Israelites that believe that we was in the Americas, man, before the transatlantic slave trade, that man, it's a lost hope for you. That's like one Israelite was trying to convince me that that we didn't go nowhere, and that we always been here and so forth. And man, I just shook my head, because trying to argue with somebody, I tried to show them, well, where is the axles and the wheels that the natives had, and can you show me any history, documented history, that they had that, or domesticated animals? And he couldn't, and he just talked around that. Okay, our freedom is coming up, and it's coming up fast, and that these nations are basically in war. You know what I'm saying? That's like the United States, our captivity here, that they need our energy. They need our energy in order to win wars, and then at the same time keep ourselves in captivity. See, man, if we help our captors in wars and be victorious, they just keep us locked down and keep us in bondage. Well, they want you to think that this is your home and that you're from the America. So then, therefore, you'll be willing to defend this land, and keep yourself in captivity. Man, they real smart, and the Israelite is not smart when he's out of covenant, and that how Israelites won't support the truth, man. They will not support the truth. Some will, it's true, but the majority are gonna support lies and falsehood and so forth, and that they not gonna wanna support things that are obvious and truthful, man. History, man, bear witness that our ancestors come over here, man, on slave ships, and that they want you to forget that. They don't want you to remember that, and they don't want you to think that that's true, and they want you to think that you always been in the Americas. Man, you better get away from that. You Israelites better get away from that, because that's your destruction. Because as I explained, that it can't be two covenants. That you're not going to be able to worship Almighty Yah when the vast majority of us find our way back into the promised land and we start worshiping Yah and build a temple and so forth, that the Israelites that are out of the promised land, men, are set for destruction. And I explain the system in some of the videos that how that they trying to develop techniques to turn you into a hybrids, and then how that they would want you to be a hybrid, because you can't never come back into covenant if you're a hybrid or half animal and half human. And then that's what's gonna happen to you Israelites that are left here in captivity, the ones that cannot see truth and think that America or this Western Hemisphere is your home, is that you shall become a hybrid. Your descendants shall become a hybrid. They working on that, the way you're going to be a half human and half animals. And then that's starting to be the psychology of the peoples today, from, the TVs and so forth. You see animals talking and doing the things that humans do and so forth. And we know in the Tanakh that they like to do just the opposite of what in the Torah, that they like to do just the opposite of what Almighty Yah ordained. He gave us dominion over the animals. Well, they finna give the animals dominion over you Israelites that are still here in captivity when our captivity ends and we go home to the promised land to worship Yah, which is the land that they call Israel. And that's another thing. Man, there's wars going on now, and that them wars should accumulate into our freedom one day. Like I say, once America lose control and are now or no label or no longer able to hold on to us, that the vast majority of us gonna get down. We're gonna get down to the promised land, and now we're not trying to be nowhere near our captors. And now we want to get far away from them as we can. We want to get far away from them as we can. But some of you Israelites, you don't see it that way, and it's like, it's baffling that you Israelites don't understand, history. Like I say, they a lot about the Israelite history, but other than that, man, they documenting, things that happen and things that are truthful. It's like, slavery. A lot of Israelites will say, well, where are the slave ships that, they brung us over on? Man, you Israelites are kind of slow, because the people who enslaved us were merchants, and their ships were used as merchant ships, and they can convert them into any kind of cargo containing ships that they want, and that's like, at first the slave ships were used to trade and bring products from east, from west to east, because the people who enslaved us got an Amorite stock to them, and then how that they was over in Americas and all around the world as Phoenicians, and then they, had cargo ships. And then that when they got into the slavery trade, all they did was transform the merchant ships into ships that can hold slaves and so forth. They probably gutted them out and then throwed a whole bunch of chains and shackles and so forth inside them. And then that once slavery was over, why should they destroy their ships because slavery was over? They just transformed them back into cargo ships to transport other materials and so forth. Basically, the materials that we Israelite harvested over here in captivity. So when you Israelites say, well, what are slave ships? Where is the slave ships that they had? Why come there isn't any? Man, you not thinking right. And you thinking real slow and you real green. You real green like this flag. You know, that flag represent, the Israelite brotherhood growth, But you Israelites, man, is slow because that they turned the merchant ships, the cargo ships, back into cargo ships. So why should they destroy their ships? Because slavery wind it down and so forth. That they turned their ships back into cargo ships that wasn't transporting slaves back into ships that transported cotton and all the things that we harvested here in captivity, and that they turned their ships back into merchant ships. That why would a ship owner go destroy his ship, but because he no longer taking slaves? No, man, they carpenters and so forth, and they knew how to transform these ships back into cargo ships. That's why you don't hardly find no slave ships nowhere. So you Israelites got to start thinking, man. That's why it's important to read and know your captors. You got to know your captors. You got to know your captors. But, we Israelites, man, are going to be free one day. And that you need to be thinking about your real home. And that how America and the Americas is not our home. And that they didn't have axles with wheels and domesticated animals, and they sure didn't have no golden calf because they didn't have no domesticated cattles here, and that how the horses and the cattle, the sheep and the goats were brung to the Americas by the conquistadors, and then how we was already a peoples up off the land in Africa living when they brung those entities here to the Americas and so forth, the conquistadors. All right, Israelites, man, it's hard for some of you Israelites to even understand that we are Israelites. If you look in the book of Jeremiah, and then you get, it's basically best to read the book of Jeremiah, period, and how it's a real important book because it's our last act on the promised land before we went into what's called Africa. And then, we went into Africa. Yeah, the promised land is on the Africa plateau, but once we got control of the promised land, that became Shem's land. That became Shem's land. So we went into Egypt from Shem's land to do the Egyptian religion. And then you read Jeremiah, man, that we, didn't come back to the promised land to be reunited with the little fruit that was taken to Babylon, that was destroyed real fast upon their return, because the vast majority of us was in Africa doing the Egyptian religion that would translate into the transatlantic slave trade. Man, Israelite history is easy, but like I say, some of you Israelites, man, it is in Wonderland, and you don't want to see truth, and you really don't want to know truth because you think you got it all figured out, and you think you got it all figured out outside Tanakh history, in which Tanakh history show you that we had goats. Man, we had goats for the service of Almighty Yah, and the natives ain't have no domesticated goats, man, that they hunted, and they didn't have Matagori to make arrows and so forth, and how did they use flint and wood, to make arrows and so forth, and that's how that they basically did things, and that they didn't have houses and so forth with roofs, and lived in animal skins, what they call teepees and so forth. So, man, you Israelites, man, it's time to wake up. It's time to wake up. That's like I showed you this image, before, and that's us in Assyria, and that's how Israelites look, and we didn't run around with feathers and so forth on our heads and so forth, and then how we had clothing and so forth, and that we had turbans and robes, and that how the natives didn't have turbans and robes and stuff, and that they barely covered their private parts and so forth, and that they walked around naked, and that how we had clothes. We had clothes to put on. Man, man, it's rough, man, trying to convince the Israelite the truth, because, like I say, that once we broke covenant, and that we're not in the truth, and that it's easily for Israelite to be deceived and be gullible for falsehood, because he's not in covenant, and the only reason I got truth is because I'm always dealing with our covenant history, which shows the way. The covenant history shows the way. The Torah tell you how we were and the things that we had. So, you can look and dispel all lies by reading the Torah or the Tanakh period, and know that we had certain things that wasn't found in the Americas until later on, and other folks brung it over. You see what I'm saying? And that it wasn't originally from here. And that how we originally had oxes, that they had carts, they had axles. A cart is not gonna move without an axle. And that how that's like in the book of Samuel, how we went and sharpened our tools with the Phoenicians, with the Philistines when they had control over us, and how that we had to get permission to sharpen our tools and so forth. And then that's like in the book of Hezekiah, when we was under siege by the Assyrians, that, well, one of their leaders said that I give you 700 horses if you're able to put men on them. And we know that the natives didn't have no horses until the Spaniards come over. That's a documented fact that ain't nobody gonna be able to change. Now you can convince yourself with ignorance and don't accept the falsehood and believe that it's real. It's not gonna change the truth. It's not gonna change the truth. Man, we Israelites, man, that's like, you got a lot of Israelite organizations, man, that's not on point, man, and that they using our captors' history, which will lead you wrong, and that they are not in Tanakh history, and that, the Israelites, man, are confused at this point. But, I pray one day that I get an establishment, and that, that the Israelites that come study with me is gonna learn the truth, and that truth will spread, like I'm trying to spread it with these videos. Some of you Israelites, man, need to tell your folks, man, to tune in to the Israelite Brotherhood, because he got clear history. And the clear history that I show is off the Tanakh. It is out of the Tanakh, our book, the book that we constructed and wrote. I got a video explaining how we are responsible for Tanakh history. All right, Israelites, like I say, man, our freedom, man, is drawing near, and that how we need to have some basic truths. We need to have some basic truths. And it's simple, man, to understand Tanakh history, man. It's wrote out clearly that our ancestors did a good job with documenting our history and putting it together. So, all you got to do is pick it up and study it, and it's what's called the Old Testament. I don't prefer that King James version, because once you read the Tanakh, that is put together by the Jewish community who think that they are the original Israelites, you get truth on heritage way lot clearer than you can that somebody that believed in demigods and then wrote, about our heritage, which is called the Old Testament and New Testament, that you ain't gonna get, the complete, you know, history like you supposed to, because they translated a lot of words and didn't have understanding of a lot of words. Alright, Israelites, man, it's easy to understand that we're not from the Americas, and that we was captured here, that we was captured in Africa, in what's called Africa, and brought here on slave ships. Brought here on slave ships, and that, that this can never be our home. And then that's like our captors need you Israelites energy. in this time, because they're having trouble and they losing power. So they need you Israelites energy to try to stay afloat. So they will try to convince you that, hey, this is your home and this is where you need to be, because they don't want you to go to the promised land to be free forever. See, once we get in our heritage in what's called the land of Israel, that we're going to be free forever, and we ain't finna never be in bondage again. We ain't never finna be in bondage again, and they don't want that. They trying to hold on to you as long as they can. And some of you Israelites are helping them to hold on to you, but not us that believe in Almighty Yah, because we're going to be free one day, and we're going to get away from this place, and we're going to be in our land like we supposed to. Yeah, some of you Israelites are, successful here in captivity, and that might stunt your desire to truly want to be free, is because you think that you got all the things that you need now here in captivity, but you don't have sovereignty. You don't have sovereignty, and no matter amount of money that you have in captivity, it is gonna equal sovereignty. Sovereignty is when we make the laws and we put basically everything together to govern ourselves without the influence of others. That's what we're striving for, and Almighty Yah gonna give it to us. All right, Israelites, this is a message from the Israelite Brotherhood. Like I say, but man, this is another thing that the Israelites need to know, to think that America is our land, is that you know they got images of the real Egyptians over in Egypt, and then how that we dealt with those folks, and that how that they got one of the images of King Necho in New York. And I went up there to see him. I got videos, showing the statue of Necho, and how Necho is not from the Americas. They didn't even find his image here in America, and how his image was found in what's called Egypt over there, man, in Africa, and that same Necho caused King Josiah to be killed after he cleaned up the Egyptian religion. So that alone show you that America is not our native land. All right, this is a message from the Israelite Brotherhood. It's time to wake up. Even though y'all hate it, it's time to wake up.